Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's Power Hour webinar on Leadership is for Everyone. I'm Bob Pyatt, and Jennifer Nathan is on with us as well, and we are the chairs of the Power Hour webinar series. However, Dr. Nathan will be serving in the role of a speaker today, so I've asked Dr. Frank Lexa to help me co-moderate today's webinar. Before we get started, we would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. Next, please. So we have just a few Zoom logistical notes here. You'll find the Zoom control panel at the bottom of your Zoom window. All the participants will be muted when they enter the webinar. If you have a technical issue, please send a chat message to panelists and hosts for technical issues. Q&A, there will be a Q&A session at the end of today's webinar. You will have the ability to submit questions by typing your questions into the Q&A pane on the control panel. You may send in your questions at any time, and we will collect these and address them at the end of the webinar. Again, if you have any technical questions, send a message to Jen Pendo, our RLI support staff, in the chat pane. I would also like to make everyone aware that this webinar is being recorded, and all participant questions will become part of the recorded webinar. Next, please.
Are you seeing the faculty?
No. I would like to welcome and briefly introduce today's presenters, beginning with my co-moderator, Frank Lexa, MD, MBA, FACR. And he has an extensive and equally impressive biography, far more than we can reasonably capture in this brief introduction. His full bio will be available with the recording, which will be released late this week. For today's purposes, here are just a few of the high-level leadership roles and accolades. Frank Lexa is an academic neuroradiologist at the University of Pittsburgh, where he is a professor and vice chair for faculty affairs. He also works for UPMC International and teaches at the Katz Business School. Dr. Lexa lectures, consults, and writes extensively on issues at the interface of healthcare and business. Frank has authored over 160 peer-reviewed papers and has also contributed multiple book and encyclopedia chapters. He has given over 2,000 invited lectures, as well as chaired and directed numerous educational meetings. His book, Leadership Lessons for Success in Healthcare, takes a systematic approach to developing medical leadership skills. Dr. Lexa is the current 2022-2023 Vice President of the American College of Radiology. He is also the Chief Medical Officer of the Radiology Leadership Institute, this RLI, of the ACR, as well as being Chairman of the Board of the RLI. He co-led the ACR's 5-year strategic planning process cycle, which was completed last year in 2022. He is also the current chair of the ACR International Economic Committee and a member of the ACR International Commission. He has served on the Board of Chancellors of the ACR for 2 terms. In 2022, he began a 3-year term as the chair of the Inter-Society Committee, which brings together all of the key organizations in US radiology. Dr. Dan Rodgers, MD, is an MSK-trained general radiologist who serves as president of Kanawha Valley Radiologists, a small private practice group in Charleston, West Virginia. He is also the current president of the West Virginia Radiological Society and is chair of the Economics Committee of the ACR's Commission on General Small Emergency and Rural Practices, in addition to serving on the ACR Council Steering Committee. Dr. Jennifer Nathan, MD, has received her Bachelor of Arts degree at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, and her medical degree at the Medical College of Ohio in Toledo. Her residency was in diagnostic radiology at Case Western Reserve University in Cleveland, Ohio, and she completed her fellowship in neuroradiology at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, Maryland. She currently serves on the ACR's Radiology Leadership Institute board. She has previously served as the YPS member on the American College of Radiology Board of Chancellors and on the Council Steering Committee. and she served as chair of the ACR Young and Early Physician Section, the YPS. And she also has served as vice chair of the ACR's membership commission. And she has served on the ACR Radiology Political Action Committee, RADPAC. She serves the American Board of Radiology as part of the Neuroradiology Initial Certifying and Maintenance of Certification Committee. She is a lecturer on neuroimaging for the AIRP in Silver Spring, Maryland. She also holds academic appointments as assistant professor of radiology at the Uniformed Services University of the Health Sciences in Bethesda, Maryland, and she is a visiting professor at the NIH in Bethesda, Maryland. Dr. Brent Wagner, MD, MBA, is the executive director of the American Board of Radiology, the ABR, based in Tucson, Arizona, following more than a decade as a volunteer, including services as an exam committee member. He has also been a trustee for genitourinary radiology and president of the Board of Governors. His early career included an opportunity to serve as course director and faculty member in the Department of Radiologic Pathology at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology, the AFIP, in Washington, D.C. Prior to joining the ABR full-time in July 2020, Dr. Wagner spent 22 years in private practice with a group of 25 radiologists in Reading, Pennsylvania. During that time, he held a variety of hospital leadership roles, including department chair, group president, medical staff president, member of the Leadership Council, and chairman of the board of the health system. Now I'd like to hand the program over to Dr. Frank Lexa to kick off this webinar with an overview of why leadership is for everyone. Frank?
Thank you, Dr. Pyatt, and thank you for that kind introduction. I'm going to be bringing my screen up here. And I want to start by, just get this up. There we go. I want to start by thanking Dr. Pyatt and Dr. Nathan for the kind invitation to come and speak today, and thank Jen Pendo and Emery Pasco from the RLI for putting all this together, and Jen doing all the hard work of getting this program up and running. And I'm honored to be on this panel with Drs. Rodgers, Nathan, and Wagner. And as you just heard, my assignment here is really to talk about an overview. Why is leadership important, and why is it for everyone, and why is the RLI the answer to how to get leadership skills, understand leadership, and improve your leadership skills? It's a lot to do in 15 minutes, but I'm going to go ahead and get started and then turn it over to the three great speakers who are going to be talking to you today about different levels and different times in their career with leadership. And I don't have any relevant disclosures for this lecture. I am a former venture capitalist, and I still do consulting with entrepreneurs and VC firms, but there is no conflict whatsoever with the lecture. Now, my goals, as I said, for the next 14 or 15 minutes is to first really emphasize to you why we need more and better leaders in US medicine. And I think this is something I've been talking about for a long time, but I think it's probably the events of the past couple of years, I think, have really driven home issues of why we need leaders who understand medicine to lead in US medicine. And we'll come back to that, but I think I just want to emphasize that this is not something we should delegate to corporate people. This is not something that the government can do particularly well. The best people to lead in US medicine are people like you. And we're going to circle back and emphasize that several times during this short talk. I want you to understand why leadership training is important to everyone in radiology, and then to introduce the RLI and discuss how its three-tier program can meet your own personal leadership needs and how it can help you in not just you personally, but also your group or your department. And just emphasizing that for knowledge workers, and that's really everybody who's on the call today, people who work with their brains, people who depend on their experience and their thinking capacity in order to get the job done every day, leadership is almost by definition distributed. And it's critical that all of you understand leadership and are involved in leadership. Now, why is leadership in particular important for us in radiology? And it's actually been part of a long conversation that I've had ever since I first became involved with the ACR in 2004. And I was actually invited to come and speak to the ACR and do a Saturday program on, non-clinical topics, including leadership and business topics. And ever since then, I've sort of just been struck by how often conversations outside of radiology and occasionally inside of radiology, and it's not unique to us in our specialty, it happens in other specialties as well, is this notion that we don't need to lead. Rather, we should turn over all of these, things that we call leadership and business and finance and other non-clinical topics. Somebody else should do that for us. And, the first time somebody said this to me, I was actually not in the US. I was in another country talking about these topics. I was the first person from outside that country who'd ever been invited to come and talk about leadership and business and finance. And this person was a manager, and she was adamant that in her country, she really felt that the radiologists should just sit in the dark and do their jobs and leave these other things to her and to her colleagues. And this is not, again, unique to physicians. This happens with other STEM professionals. And during my time at Wharton, I dealt with a lot of people who are engineers and, doing a wide variety of other STEM types of jobs. And, they often heard the same thing, but they were coming to Wharton because they weren't convinced. And I think they're right. And this is the school. This is the radiologists should stick to their craft and leave the business and leadership work to others. Again, that person in that other country actually said they leave it to the grown-ups, which I thought was particularly derogatory, but thank goodness that didn't happen in the US. At least that embarrassing thing happened somewhere else. And for those of you who don't live in Pennsylvania, and I spend part of every month in Eastern Pennsylvania and part of every month in Western Pennsylvania. And in the southeast corner of Pennsylvania, it's one of the leading parts of the United States for this particular agricultural product. If we were doing this in person, I'd ask for a show of hands and do a call out. But as you can see, this is, again, one of the best places in the US to make these things, but these are mushrooms. And everyone knows that the way you make mushrooms, say it politely, is to keep them in the dark and put manure on them. And I think that's how I describe this school. So this is why I don't play poker, because you can already tell what I think and how I feel about this. But this is the notion that, other people should do this. Again, leaving it to the grown-ups, to be particularly pejorative. And I would argue that instead we are elite professionals who do difficult esoteric work, and we should be led by our own. And so if you're one of these brave people who works for NASA, ever since the first American went into outer space, there's always been somebody on the ground while these people are up there, so that one of their own is involved in helping and leading and communicating with the NASA bureaucracy, the NASA administration, while they're up there doing the dangerous stuff like she did when she went up. Or people like this. If you have ever met any fighter pilots, this is back in the popular imagination right now because of the second of the Top Gun movie. But when you meet these, imagine being led by somebody who hadn't, walked in their shoes, so to speak, who'd actually lived this. And I think prejudice is that that's how we should do this. So I'm strongly in the second school. If I can make it any more emphatic, we need leaders like you, because all of you in the course of your careers are going to have a pretty simple choice. You can lead or you can be led. It's really that simple. So if we don't lead ourselves, somebody else will lead us. And given some of the fiascos that we've seen with corporatization in US healthcare, and some of the things we're likely to see in the next couple of years, and some of the ways that the government has not done a particularly good job in some cases of what they do with their relationship with us, I would really like to see people like you leading by the time you have a chance to go through our programs and learn leadership skills. Now, this was a quote. The top quote is something that I don't remember saying, but a friend of mine wrote it down after one of the early programs that we did with the ACR. And this was actually before there was an RLI, but I'm happy to own the quote. I like the quote. I have made some adaptations to it on the bottom, put a little bit of, like a little bit of hedging like we sometimes have to do in a radiology report. I think that almost anyone can learn to be a leader, but I have met a few people who really can't do it. Just missing something that's necessary there, but 99% of people in US radiology probably can learn to be a leader, but certainly had a few people at Wharton anyway who couldn't do it. And also if you want to, this is one of these things that if you're going to do it well, you really need to want to do it. And it's one of the things I sort of think about here is that there are a few things like learning to fly a plane, which is something I've learned to do, and it's a ton of fun. But if you don't want to do it, you probably shouldn't do it because it is dangerous. And it's like when your friends encourage you to ride a motorcycle and you really don't want to ride a motorcycle, then sometimes those stories don't end so well. But if you want to be a leader, pretty much everybody on this program today can learn to be a leader. And you can push back on me and tell me, well, I'm shy, or I'm not a good leader, or I don't like to tell people what to do. And if those are your answers, then you definitely should come to one of our programs, because there have been some great studies, including one from Stanford Business School, that showed that far and away introverts make better leaders, particularly for the long term. So if you tell me you're introverted, I say you're perfect, and we'll just teach you how to do it. It's a little bit different. And leadership, we have a lot of myths, which I don't have time to go into right now, but we'll bust those myths and tell you how to do it. Again, our slogan, mantra, and this is something that we don't just say, this is something we live, is that it's for everyone. So if you tell me, well, I'm this, or I'm that, or I grew up this way, or whatever, the answer is that everyone can be a leader. And we do this in a variety of ways, and we help people. Even if you don't want to be an alpha leader in the sense of you don't want to be the chair, you don't want to be the president of your group, you probably would be better than the people who want those jobs. But in any case, you can at least help the people who do take those jobs on. And again, in the organizations in which we work, it's the case that there are leaders and should be leaders at just about every level, because the person at the top can't possibly do all those jobs. And I met a few people who are pretty big deal leaders outside of medicine, people who run major corporations like Bloomberg, or Mr. Gates, Mr. Wozniak. It's very interesting to talk to people who do these sorts of things, because ultimately you need to learn how to lead, even if you are the smartest person in the room. And those are all extremely smart people. We do this in many ways. We've got these online courses, we've got podcasts like we're doing today, live events, and a special emphasis on doing things for the residents and fellows. So I really encourage you to take a look at what we have to offer. We've said we would talk a little bit about some vignettes, some stories about leadership, and I just want to share, and the people who are following me have some great material on sort of these three levels of leadership. And I will just say that, one of the things you get when you get this much gray hair, and you've been doing this for almost 3 decades, is you see examples of people who got it right and got it wrong at each of these levels. And it helps to get it right early. And I certainly, even in some of the worst hiring situations, and this is not now, and right now there are a tremendous number of jobs that are open in the US, but people who came to our programs when they were residents and got involved in the RFS early, those people got jobs even in the toughest times, whereas other people really had to kind of, take a job that they didn't want, or, really got into some trouble early on. And we will help you with this, and we'll help you to get your career off on the right start. And just to put it in, kind of crude terms, but if you start the wrong job on a partnership track, and then you have to, after 3 years, start again at another place, it's not the end of the world, but it's better to get it right then, because that really adds up. And by the time you're 60, that's a big chunk of money and a lot of time and difficulty in your life. In the middle of your career, I have friends who are extremely happy in the middle of their career, but as you go to RSNA, you also meet people who are kind of looking for something else, looking for something better. And a lot of times the problem isn't the job, it's how people have approached it. and they've kind of commoditized themselves, and they have a job, but they don't have a career. They don't have a strategy. They don't have a plan. They don't have milestones. They don't have goals. It's just, I show up to work, I do my work, I get my paycheck, boom. Not judging, but there are some people who are happy with that, but a lot of times the unhappiness comes because they're not learning to lead, they're not doing projects, they're not growing in their careers. And then finally, at the top level, when you have this experience and when you're running a group or you're running a department, everyone who's ever been there will tell you that this is where it gets hard. Some people think, well, that's the goal or that's the end, and it's really the beginning. And we do things at Wharton where we deal with people who are CEOs at Fortune 500 companies. These are incredibly successful, smart people at the top of very important companies. And it's hard, and it's hard for them. It's not over, it's the beginning. And as a friend of mine said, he's the head of a very big tech company, very important company, said it's sort of like getting a black belt. If you've never gotten a black belt in the martial arts, you think of it as, well, it's a goal. It's like a trophy and you're done. It's the beginning. At least that's in the school that he had studied in. It's the beginning. You've learned enough to begin the big learning. And that's what our CEOs and the people at the top tell us. Now, I want to give you a brief overview before I stop with what the RLI program portfolio looks like today. And we're weighted heavily towards the resident and fellow training. I know we worked hard to make this very equilateral, but we weighted towards the residents and fellows. That's been a very conscious decision that Anne-Marie and I have made as we've redesigned the program. We have scholarships that include flying you out for our summit. I can't do a better price than free, and throw in the plane ticket. So you might want to apply for some of those for those of you who are in training. We have things for mid-career, we have executive level, and things are not strictly segregated. So we have a lot of programs that are in a sweet spot where you can network with people who aren't at the same stage. But this 3-tier program seems to work very well. So I want to close now and just give you some next steps. I tend in my talks to try to tell you this is what you should be doing after the talk. This is what you should be doing on Monday morning if you came to one of our weekend programs. But for those of you who haven't joined the ACR, please do that. If you're in training, it's free. Again, can't get much better than that. For those of you who haven't signed up for the RLI, you should do that and start participating in some of our programs. And for those of you who are not already involved, as you know, the ACR is structured as kind of a confederation. So your state chapter is where you should begin. If you are going to take a journey into the ACR, it's a good place to start. And make sure you get a chance to do those things. And I want to thank you very much for your attention. It's been an honor to speak to you today. That's my work email if you want to get in touch with me. And that's me with one of my favorite corporate giants. That's the Steve Wozniak from Apple. We call him the good Steve of the two Steves. And he is even more fantastic in person than his legends would lead you to believe. And the legends are all, of course, very good. So with that, I want to say thank you. And now it's my honor to introduce Dan Rodgers, and he'll be your next speaker. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dan Rodgers. I'm going to talk to you today about some early career leadership experiences. Okay. So what is the definition of early career? Well, you're either just starting out, either you're still in training or you're a few years into your first job. You probably have no formal position or title. You're just a resident or a staff radiologist. And the ACR Young Physician section is there for these sorts of early career people, and they define it as the first 8 years out of training or age 40, whichever is later. So I'm going to tell you a little bit over the course of this talk about my own first 8 years out of training and my leadership journey with that. So you can see over the past 8 years, I've collected a few leadership titles, and I won't go through all of these, but I will tell you that I didn't actually seek out any of these titles. They all just sort of happened as a result of things that I was doing. And as I prepared this talk and I thought about the things that I was doing that led me to acquire some leadership positions, I came up with about 5 different things. And we're going to go through each of those and talk about some stories related to each of them and some examples from my own experience. So first off, when you join a new practice, or even if you're still in residency, you need to prove yourself a competent radiologist and a trustworthy coworker. That is the foundation on which everything else rests. Second, when you're coming into a new practice, leverage your unique experiences. Third, show up to work, show up to meetings, show up to different events, and share your opinions in a tactful and respectful fashion. Fourth, notice problems in the workday, notice problems around you in the hospital, and try to be part of the solution for those. And then finally, be willing to try new things and don't be afraid to fail. So we're going to go through each of those now. So in joining a new practice, or even in starting a new residency or fellowship position, the first thing that you need to do as far as leadership is to prove that you are a good radiologist. So if you're joining a new group, you need to show the other partners that you can do exactly what everyone else is doing just as well as they can do it. And if you can do that, then they're going to trust you with leadership positions later on. They're going to appoint you to committees. They're going to ask you to work on projects. When you share a perhaps unpopular opinion, they're going to take what you say a little bit more seriously if they respect you as a radiologist. So this really is my first piece of advice to anybody early in their career, that you need to kind of build that level of trust and competence and credibility before you can do anything else. So first 6 months in a practice, don't try to come in and change everything. Don't try to be a hot shot and suggest, oh, this is how we did everything in fellowship. Just learn to do what they're doing and do it well. So secondly, leverage your unique experiences. So in joining a new group, you're going to have less radiology experience than the other people there, and certainly less experience in that particular place at that particular hospital. However, you do bring a wealth of other knowledge and experiences to the practice. It might be something from your college major. It might be a prior career that you had before medicine. It might be organizations you're involved in the community, or it might be something from your training in residency or fellowship. So an example of this in my own career, I joined a practice in 2014 that was still using medical transcriptionists. So, going back to my first point about doing what everyone else does as well as they do, I had to learn to dictate the entire report to a transcriptionist, say everything, do everything. But once I learned how to do that, a few months in, the hospital decided that they were going to fire all the transcriptionists and implement PowerScribe. So no one in my group had used it before, but of course I had in training. So I volunteered to lead the project. And so I imported all of my templates that I had used before. I adapted them to the local setting, and I worked with the implementation team to get everything off to a great start. And, we implemented it. It was a smashing success. There were huge efficiency gains for the practice, and that gave me tremendous credibility with my partners that I was able to do this for them. Initially, they were very skeptical of doing that. And then after I had kind of set everything up for them and showed them how it worked, they were all amazed that they hadn't done it years before. So I think pretty much every practice that wants voice recognition has it now. But if you're coming out of training, you may have experience dealing with AI or dealing with new procedures or different kinds of technology that you can introduce into the practice. And you may know more about that than anybody currently in the practice. So don't be afraid to share your experiences and teach them something new, or bring something new to the practice. That's certainly something that you can do, even if you have less experience in some other areas. Third, show up, go to meetings. There's a ton of meetings in every radiology group, in every radiology department, in every hospital. There are medical executive committees, there are credentials committees, there are CME committees, there's 1,000 committees. And honestly, having served on these things, people are always looking for fresh faces to come to these. So volunteer yourself. Join committees locally, join committees with the American College of Radiology or your state chapter or specialty societies. Show up to these things. That's a big part of success, and big part of just networking and meeting people is going to these things regularly. And another piece of advice that I have is go speak to your radiology department administrator. Just kind of make rounds once a week, check in, see how's it going. Find out what's new in the department. That way they get to know you. You find out what's going on. You don't have to have a special title or a special role to do that, but just kind of it shows that you care and you're interested, and you want to make a difference and do things. And then voice your opinions. As I mentioned, build that layer of credibility and trust, but don't be afraid to share what you want to say. I mean, as a leader of a group, I have to say, I want to hear people that disagree with me. I'm not going to know what other people are thinking unless they say it, but do say it in a respectful and tactful and careful fashion. So just an example from my own life of how showing up is important. I was 1 year out of fellowship, and I went to my state chapter meeting. The way our state chapter works, you can run for a secretary treasurer. That's a 2-year position. And then after that, you automatically rotate into the vice president position for 2 years. And then after that, you become president. So I had gone to my state chapter meeting as a resident for several years. And I was going to this meeting with the thought of maybe running for secretary treasurer. So I go to the meeting, and the person who was rising to president had moved out of state 2 months prior. So she was no longer eligible. The next in line, that guy was not expecting to be president, and he had some family stuff going on and just didn't really have the time to devote to that. So he declined. And so I was elected straight to become the president of the state chapter 1 year out of finishing my fellowship. And it was a great experience. I learned a lot. I had some experience, having gone to chapter meetings before. But I mean, that was just a perfect example of the importance of showing up, because you kind of never know what's going to happen. Another example was I was appointed pretty early on based on a recommendation from one of my colleagues to our hospital's med exec committee. And so I started going to that. And, initially you don't know anything and you don't say anything, but hospital administrators are there. After you go to these things for several months, people in the C-suite get to know who you are, and then they start to reach out to you when they have questions about radiology. And so I was getting emails and phone calls from high-level hospital leadership pretty early on, and they were going to me instead of more senior partners, just because I was a more regular face for them in the meetings. So get on committees, do these sorts of things. You'll be surprised at the doors that open up just from doing that. My fourth piece of advice for you is notice problems and solve them. And this is something that you should be doing just in your life in general, in radiology. This actually is advice that famous venture capitalist Paul Graham has. He runs the Y Combinator, which is an accelerator to help startup companies kind of get off the ground. But this is what he says to people who want to start a startup company, is just notice a problem in your life and try to come up with a solution for it. And you can do this in radiology. I mean, in the course of a day, we could all write down 10 problems that we have. I mean, whether it's some scheduling issue with patients or scheduling issues with radiologists or some problem with the PACS or dictation or something else, there's a million problems. So just pick one and try to start solving it. And I mean, the best side effect of that is, number one, it's going to make your life easier. But number two, it's going to lead you down different rabbit holes of new projects, meeting new people who help you with that, new experiences, and learning about different aspects of everything that goes into making a department or a practice or a hospital work. So one example from my career of that, there was actually a problem that was pretty hard not to notice. I was hired to a private practice group on a 2-year partnership track. And so I worked my 2 years as an employee, and I'm so excited when I finally make partner. I'm going to get my first partner paycheck. It's going to be a great big paycheck. I've worked so long for this. I get the paycheck, and it was less that month than my pre-partner paycheck. And so I was actually pretty livid. So I go to the other partners and I'm like, what is going on? And so they tell me that over the last few months, their revenues had strangely been declining. They didn't really know what was going on. They thought it was just some sort of cyclical thing. And I could have at that point just said, well, I've wasted 2 years of my life. I'm looking for a new job, but I didn't. I had a reason to be in that place at that time. And I'm also just kind of stubborn. So I made it my personal mission to figure out why the revenues were down and figure out how to solve it. So I ended up investigating our billing company, deciding they weren't doing a good job, learned a ton about medical billing. We ended up switching companies. I ended up investigating all of our insurance company contracts, figured out that they weren't paying us what they were supposed to be, ended up renegotiating all of those, dealing with different experts to do that. I knew nothing about any of this, absolutely nothing. But it really was just kind of having the motivation to solve a problem and throwing myself at it until it was solved. And so this was kind of just something that I kept doing and doing. And as I did one thing, it led to another, and you learn more. Then you realized, there was this other problem out there. So, this really is one of the best pieces of advice I have for anybody, is to just kind of start chipping away. Maybe you start on some small problem, but it may lead to something else. And then over time, your successes will build on successes, and you'll start to really see a difference. And people will respect you as a leader, as someone who gets things done and who solves these issues. So whether you have aspirations to any sort of real leadership title or not, this is something you should be doing. And it's a way for you to lead, whether you have any formal titles or formal positions other than radiologist. So finally, my last piece of advice, and that kind of goes back to the last one, all of these really tie together, is try new things and be willing to fail. So experiment with different stuff while you're early in practice. I mean, aside from whatever clinical area you might be in, there's plenty of other stuff that goes into making a department or a hospital or practice work. So there's operations, there's quality and safety, there's governance, both at a local and a national level, informatics and IT, research, economics. Play around with all these things, see what interests you, see what you want to do, get on committees that have to do with any of these things, and find out what you're good at. One example from my life about this, I'm on the GSER economics committee. I joined that early on in my practice, and one of the tasks that we had in 2020 was writing a resolution for the ACR Council regarding general and multi-specialty radiology, trying to get a task force created to look into the practice of general radiology and what we needed to support that and promote that. So I wrote this resolution in partnership with the committee and took it to the council, and the resolution actually failed at the council. I'd never written a resolution before. I didn't really know how that worked. But fortunately, the Board of Chancellors decided to create the task force anyway, even though the resolution failed. And that was chaired by Bob Pyatt, who's moderating this session tonight. And they came up with a lot of great recommendations. But I took that experience about writing that resolution, and the following year, another issue came up regarding the interpretation of medical exams by non-physicians. And so I wanted to strengthen the ACR's position against that. So again, in partnership with GSER Economics Committee, I wrote a couple of resolutions, and I learned from my mistakes the first time around. And I knew what to do to make sure that everyone knew what was in those resolutions ahead of time. I knew what to do to kind of introduce the idea to everyone, get critiques early on and make changes. And both resolutions, even though they were on a pretty controversial topic, they passed overwhelmingly. So don't be afraid to fail, learn from your mistakes, build on that, and you can do better next time. So those are my takeaways from my first 8 years out, the leadership positions that I've got involved in, some different situations that I've had. So first off, prove yourself competent. 2, leverage your unique experiences. Show up to meetings, speak out respectfully, notice problems in your daily life and solve them, and don't be afraid to try new things. So feel free to contact me. That's my email address. I'm happy to talk about any of this or any other leadership experiences. And next up on our evening agenda is Dr. Nathan, who will be talking about her experiences as a mid-career radiologist.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you, Dan, for the passing over to me. First off, I want to say thank you for the invitation from the RLI. It's really such an honor to be on a panel with such respected radiologists. So as Dan was saying, I'm going to be talking about my topic is lessons that I have learned from a mid-careers perspective. And so just to give you an idea of how long I have been practicing, I have been out practicing as a radiologist about 11 years post-training. And in that time, I have learned a lot of lessons, but what I'm going to do today is share with you what I think are the most high impact, impactful lessons that I have learned that have provided me with long-term career success, not only in radiology, but also success as a leader in radiology. So the way that I've structured my talk is I have selected the 3 most important lessons that I have learned. So first off, we're going to talk about the importance of networking, connecting with people and building relationships with people. And that gives you visibility so that when opportunities arise, they think of you for those opportunities, put you in the front line. The next, we're going to talk about how to build the ideal job or leadership position for yourself. And I believe that in any job, any practice or any department that you're in, there's always resources around you that you can tap into to help build your dream career. You just need to think about what your goals are and what resources you need to evaluate the resources around you to be able to incorporate those in your job. I'm going to give you some examples of how I have done that. And then lastly, we're going to talk about emotional intelligence and interpersonal skills. And I can't stress enough how important this is for your job overall. Having good relationships and interactions with your colleagues will provide a more positive working environment, positive job satisfaction. And if you are in a leadership role, will help you to bring people together of various personalities to have a more cohesive group to be more efficient in accomplishing goals and tasks. So be a more effective leader. So let's start with the first lesson. So my first lesson is the importance of networking. And I think this is probably the most important lesson that I have learned in my career. And networking has really been the most critical in me finding out about opportunities and poising myself for opportunities in my career. So what is networking? And I think the way that I think of networking is it's really developing professional contacts. So when you're starting out in your career, you build a foundation, you know people from your residency or fellowship, if you do fellowship, and you start building on those contacts. So as you get to the mid-career phase where I'm at, you've got a large group of people that you know from interacting with this person who introduces you to another person, et cetera. And during these interactions, you're given the opportunity to really exchange information and ideas about what your aspirations are for your career. And when those opportunities do arise, somebody may think of you like, hey, this person I know is interested in this. Let me reach out to them. So networking really gives you visibility and puts you at the front line for opportunities for yourself. So I have 2 examples I want to give you how networking has helped me in my career. So my first job out of training was at a community hospital that had no academic opportunities, no educational opportunities whatsoever. But I've always had an interest in teaching and education. And so I kind of sat back and thought, well, what do I want to do? Like, where would I like to teach? Where would I like to be an educator at? And my dream had always been to be a teacher at AIRP. And I didn't know anybody at AIRP. And I'm a neuroradiologist. I didn't know anybody in the neuroradiology section at AIRP. But what I did have going for me is that through networking that I had already been doing as a resident and fellow at the FACR, I had made many connections and professional contacts. So although I did not know anybody at AIRP, I knew people that did know the chief of neuroradiology at AIRP at that time. And so in just casual conversation, I mentioned to people that I knew worked with this individual, my interest and enthusiasm for being part of AIRP. And one of them had connected me with the chief of neuroradiology at that time at AIRP. And so I had some initial conversations with the chief, and how they started me out at AIRP is I reviewed the cases that the residents contributed for the neuro section. And then I would take their cases and convert them into a teaching file format. So working on this project and working with the chief gave me visibility, and I was then offered slots to teach at AIRP, and I'm still teaching at AIRP today. Another example I want to give you about how networking has helped me with my career is committee work that I've done in the ACR. So when I was a first-year radiology resident, one of my attendings came up to me with a copy of the ACR bulletin. And she said, I don't know if you've heard of the ACR or if you get the bulletin, but the ACR is a great organization and they offer fellowship opportunities. And I think you would be really great at doing one of these. So she hands me the bulletin and says, just consider applying, no pressure. And so I took it home and I went through the bulletin. I looked at the section which listed the fellowships. And the one that really drew my attention was what was called the J.T. Rutherford Fellowship at that time. It's now known as the Rutherford Laventy Fellowship. And what really struck me about it is it talked about legislative bills and how policy changes affecting radiologists and the landscape of radiology. And I knew nothing about this topic. So I thought, oh, wow, this would be really great to go to DC and learn all about these different bills and legislative actions that are going on and kind of be at the front line of helping to shape the future of radiology. So I applied for the fellowship and I was lucky to get a spot. And so I went out to DC for a week and I worked with the government relations department. And during that time, I met with senators, members of Congress, and staffers talking about important bills and legislation for radiologists. But what I was doing, but not even realizing, is I was networking. I met all the staff for the government relations department. And after I finished my fellowship, a few months later, there was an opening on the RADPAC, Radiology Political Action Committee, looking for a resident representative. And the government relations staff thought of me because they had worked with me and I had networked with them. And so they offered me the position, I accepted, and I spent many years actually serving as a radiologist in training on RadPac. And during my years on RadPac, I again was doing networking. I was meeting all different kinds of radiologists in all different practice settings across the country over those years. And working with those individuals also opened up opportunities for me, because working with me, they thought of me for different committees or different work that they were doing, and then they would offer them to me, and then I would go on to do additional work with other committees. And so now let's fast forward to 10 years down the road or so. I have served as vice chair and chair of the YPS. I've served on council steering committee. I've served on board of chancellors, and I'm currently on the RLI board. And these are all opportunities that would not have existed for me had I not been networking and meeting people and being thought of when those opportunities arose. So next, I want to give you just some tips on how to network, how to start building your base and your foundation of networking, if you have not already done so. So just on a local level, at your respective group, consider leading conferences or getting involved with conferences. This is an opportunity for you to work with radiologists in your group and also physicians in other areas of the hospital. If there are no conferences and there's something that interests you, consider starting your own. Also consider looking into the leadership positions in your group. Most groups have different roles like chief of quality and safety, chief of MRI, etc. Consider volunteering for those positions when they do arise. And then outside of your department, consider looking into different leadership roles within your healthcare hospital system, boards or committees. It's an opportunity for you to work outside the department, get some more visibility and network within your healthcare system overall. And then on a national level, I cannot say enough about the positions and leadership roles that the ACR offers to you. If you go to the ACR's website, there's a listing of all different committees and commissions of just diverse areas of interest that I highly recommend that you check out and consider volunteering for. And then I lastly want to mention an important area to network at, and that's the ACR annual meeting. And the ACR annual meeting, if you have not attended, is a meeting that occurs every year around April or May, and it always happens in DC. And at the meeting, you have an opportunity to rub shoulders with radiologists from all across the country and all different kinds of practice settings, all different kinds of specialties. And I do recommend that if you go, to consider bringing perhaps a way that they can get a hold of you, some contact information like a business card. So when you meet somebody, you can just kind of readily hand them your card so they can easily get a hold of you when they think about you for opportunities. So now let's move on to my next lesson, which is utilizing resources to build your dream career. So I'm not sure if our participants have seen this, but last week, this issue was released by the ACR Bulletin. So this is the most recent issue. And in it is an article that actually is exactly what I wanted to talk about tonight. And the article is titled Repositioning Your Role. Dread going to work, improve your daily life and well-being by working with your leaders to create the job you want. And there's a really great quote that I liked in this article that is what I'm going to kind of dive a little bit into here in the next few minutes. So the quote is, many times people don't take the time to say what's not working. What can I change to make it more aligned with my priorities? You have the power to try to do that, to give yourself a more satisfying career. And so I really want to drive home the point that you are kind of the master of your destiny. And I think it's just figuring out what your goals are and what would make you happy and bring happiness to you in your career, and then figure out how to kind of draw that map to get to point B. So I would say, just kind of figure out what your career goals are and then do some research about resources that are available to you. So I want to give you an example of how I did this in my career. So as I mentioned previously, my first job out of training was at a small community hospital with very little academic opportunities, but I really had an interest in teaching academics. And so I built a hybrid academic community position for myself. It didn't happen overnight. I built it over a few years. But basically what I did is I kind of sat down and thought, well, what do I want to be doing? What's my dream job? What's my dream career? And I wanted to do teaching and I wanted to do research. And so I sat and thought about, well, what resources do I have around me? I don't think I have a lot of resources at my respective hospital, but what can I utilize in my vicinity? And the more I thought about it, we did have a radiology residency program at another facility down the street. And we also had a medical school just down the street as well. So I talked to the leadership at both of these facilities and I coordinated for us to have, for the first ever, a radiology residency program. So I had set up for a resident to rotate with us on a month basis. I had a curriculum set up and they got a community experience outside their academic facility. And then for the medical students, I set up also for them a curriculum and rotation schedule for them to see the different aspects of radiology and see if that's potentially a career choice for them in the future. And then based on my interactions with the leadership on setting these programs up, they offered me teaching opportunities at their facilities. So I was also doing lectures at the residency program and at the medical school. And also the leadership recommended me for a position on the IRB when one became available, just based upon working with me. And that was really a great opportunity for me to see how the IRB process happens and how to set up a good protocol, a good research protocol and submission for IRB approval, something I would need a few years down the road. So kind of going back to my facility, as I mentioned, we did not have a lot of opportunities there. But the more I thought about it, we did have a very vibrant traumatic brain injury population. And so what I did was I talked to the referring physicians that had sent me brain MRIs on their patients and set up some relationships with them. And we started doing monthly conferences. So they would do the clinical, present the patient, and then I would show the imaging aspect. And then we talked together about prognosis and treatment and such. So it was an opportunity for me to network and also start building some conferences and such for myself. And based upon that kind of interaction with these clinicians, they offered for me opportunities to do research. So I started setting up research protocols on TBI with them. And we set up many research protocols and different national agencies throughout the country, such as NIH. So I kind of became the go-to TBI expert. So I started at a place that had nothing academic, and I was able to build it based upon resources in my vicinity. So here's my tips. First of all, I would say know yourself. What are you looking for in your career? What would bring you happiness? Maybe make a mental list or even just jot it down. What are your goals for your career? Or maybe even like what sort of leadership roles do you want to be holding? And then look at what resources you have available to you. You may have to build it, but it is possible. Look and see what you have at your facility or locally, or even on a national level that you can use to incorporate into your job. And then I would say, lastly, maybe talk to your leadership about what your goals and interests are and see if they can think of any additional opportunities that maybe you're not even aware of that you could do at your facility. Okay, so my last lesson is having success with strong interpersonal skills. So I will just say off the cuff, there are challenging personalities that you're going to run into everywhere, and having good interpersonal skills and good interactions with people is going to push you to be successful in various aspects of your life. And it's really essential that no matter what kind of personalities that you're dealing with in the working environment, that you're able to work with these people. I think having a job is kind of like a marriage. You know, you're in it for the long run. You're going to be with these people, seeing them quite a bit. So it's important you get along with them. So I have one example of kind of not a great interpersonal interaction early on in my career. And it's my first job again. So I was hired as a neuroradiologist, but there was already a neuroradiologist at this facility. And she had actually been there kind of as the queen for years. And she was kind of more of end of career, just to kind of give you an idea where she was, at what phase in her career she was. And so then I was hired and brought in. I'm kind of the young whippersnapper. And I immediately sensed this kind of apprehension and competitiveness from her. And just felt that she felt, just threatened by me, I guess, that I was kind of the new person on the block. And so I was early in my career, and I had not even learned a lot about emotional intelligence and gotten a lot into the weeds with how to best manage these situations. So at the time, what I did to manage it is I tried to maintain professionalism, always be courteous and friendly to her, to kind of just keep a good working environment. But fast forward where I am now, 10 or 11 years down the road, and I've learned a lot about emotional intelligence. And I've had various interpersonal interactions with people. And I've learned a lot. So I think if I could go back in time, even though we were able to have a professional working relationship, I think I could have made it better. And how I would have done a little bit better is I would have tried to build more of a team atmosphere with her and have more camaraderie. So for example, I think what I would have done is if I had an interesting neuro case, just show it to her kind of a sidebar and be like, hey, what do you think of this case? I was kind of thinking this, but what do you think? Or what else can I put in my differential? Or even like monthly, just get together and go over interesting neuro cases or go over interesting journal articles and learn together about maybe new techniques in neuro. So just some things I think I could have done a little bit differently knowing what I know now if I could go back in time. So here are some of my tips on interpersonal skills. So first of all, I would say, understand the people around you better, understand maybe their personalities, or maybe just kind of put yourself in their shoes to see, well, how would I feel if I was in their situation? Like I could have done with my colleague. How would I feel if I was, the person who had been the established radiologist for years, and then all of a sudden there's this new person in my same specialty. And then also think about their needs. Maybe there's some other things going on that have nothing to do with you. Maybe there's something else in the job that's upsetting them, or they're having some kind of personal issues. And I think many times people over-perceive that, oh, this is because of me, but most situations, I think usually it doesn't have anything to do with you at all. So it's just kind of being a little bit, looking a little bit beyond and seeing what's really going on with this person outside of you. And then also, once you kind of figure out what the personality issue is or what kind of issues may be going on with that person, then the next step is finding solutions. So now that you've kind of figured out what the problem is, how can you work with this person and figure out ways to do that? So my last slide here is I just want to mention a text that's been, I think, just really essential to me in understanding emotional intelligence and being strong with interpersonal skill development. And this was a text written back in 1995, and it's still timely to this day. I think the concepts are still relevant to this day. And it was written by Daniel Goleman about emotional intelligence, why it can matter more than IQ. And so what he talks about in the text is these 5 different bullet points on how to best manage different interpersonal situations. And so the first step is to, first of all, have self-awareness, understand your own emotions and how you feel about that interaction with that person. And then the next step is self-regulation. So before you respond and react, take a step back and think about the next best logical, rational way to handle this situation. Next is empathy. Understand the other person's emotions. Just kind of look beyond how you're feeling and see how the other person could potentially be feeling. And then the next step is motivation. What is your goal of this interaction? What are you hoping to get out of it? Do you want to be working closely with this person on projects or just have good working relationship at work? And then lastly is social skills, being effective at communication with this individual in this situation. So with that, this is my end of my presentation. I want to thank you for your time. I'm going to be here for the Q&A component of this webinar to answer any questions. And you can also reach out to me at my personal email, which I have here, nathanje77@yahoo.com. So I'm now going to turn things over to Dr. Wagner for the next part of this webinar. Dr. Wagner?
Thank you. Really honored to be included in this program. I did note, however, that I was considered the late career radiologist, and that certainly is a reasonable label to put on me. About 14 months ago, I gave a presentation at RSNA for mid-career radiologists. So somewhere in the last 14 months, I transitioned from mid-career to late career. I don't remember the exact day, but it has me worried about what's going to happen next. But in any event, I probably have more mistakes to share than my colleagues. I really enjoyed their presentations, and almost everything they said I wish I had done at an earlier stage in my career. Just a couple of things about sort of late career individuals in general. This was a paper in JACR some years ago, talked about really about clinical care, but this was about aging and cognitive reserve. And these authors talked about crystallized intelligence, and it really has to do with what did you learn over the course of your lives about your discipline, your profession, or your trade. And in it, they cite some animal research, and they were talking about the way mice would react to environments that were more interactive than those otherwise considered standard. And I realized as I wrote this slide, of course, it implies that it's the neurons of the aging radiologists are more interconnected than those of mice, and they were just comparing 2 different groups of mice. So in any event, I would appreciate, certainly, I know that my ability to rapidly get through a stack of CT scans or MRIs is not perhaps what it was 20 years ago, and that's normal. You get experience, but there are some things that late career individuals such as myself might struggle with. And again, this is more about clinical care. We're going to get to the leadership part in just a second. And this really kind of struck me as relevant for today's discussion because it is about the clinical roles that sort of start to narrow as we get further along. And this really applies more to private practice, I think, than it does to academics, because in academics, you probably started out with a very narrow role. But what happens as that clinical role might narrow is, at least for a time, the leadership role broadens. And at least for many of us, the story then becomes that it starts to narrow again too, but for different reasons, less about sort of ability and the attention we place on these things, and more about personal preference. So we'll end up there. And really all I'm going to be presenting, there aren't right answers to most of this. In many ways, these are just reflections on 30 years of post-residency practice. And perhaps this will provoke some thoughtful deliberations about your own views of either transitioning into late career or being, as I am already, as a late career leader. But really what's happening is it's about this expanded perspective, and I'm going to go through several of these, but that one perhaps is the most important. So as I was going over what changes, and this changes somewhat early, and we heard it from the last two speakers, that they start looking at, even at, again, at a younger stage in their career than I am, the ecosystem of the healthcare delivery system. Right? How does it work? What does it mean for radiologists? What value do we provide? And I think, admittedly, when you first come out of training, it's all about getting that next study read, getting it read well, being clinically competent, and delivering on what we owe to the patient and the ordering physician. But at the same time, we need to understand that our value may be much more broadly viewed. And I suppose part of this is what has us evolve as leaders, because we're able to see that there are economic issues involved, there are population health issues. We are consultants as part of a clinical team. And these are all things that are beyond that next CT scan. They are, again, more broadly viewed, I suppose, as how we serve our stakeholders. And who are those stakeholders? I used to say when I was the department chair that I had 5 stakeholder groups, because I was not in academics. In academics, you'd have at least 2 additional stakeholder groups, the residents and the medical students. But in a private practice, you still have multiple stakeholders. You have the hospital administration, and then by extension, the governing board, the support staff, the technologists within the department, the medical staff, of course, the referring physicians, the patients, and these are in no particular order. I'd probably say that a lot of what we do really should be focused on the patient first. As I mentioned, if you're in academics, or even a lot of us in community hospital settings, as I was, had at least some element of education and training that we were providing. And then lastly, our colleagues, or ourselves. In other words, the radiologists themselves were among that stakeholder group. And that was important too, to keep that in mind. So beyond expanded perspective that grows over time as we get out of training and start to see a lot of these interactions with other elements or components of the healthcare delivery system. We have inherent obligations to mentor and coach. And I think the common themes, this by itself would probably be a 2-hour topic, and I understand that. And what I mean by common themes here is that it should be independent of your practice environment. And this would include patients, and that is the idea that an awful lot of these things, they come over time. Some of the themes that have already been talked about, I'll talk about in a little more detail. That is, showing up is a big part of this, and going to those meetings. And sometimes those are, you're the junior person at the table, right? And over time, of course, with patients, you realize that you become that individual who has that long time horizon in 2 ways. One, your own career, of course, plays out over decades, not just a few years. But in addition, I think it's about looking sometimes at what are you trying to accomplish as an organization, as a radiology group, for example, as a department, as a university setting, or a hospital system. And it's not about the next month's billing. It's more than that. And I think that's part of what goes into this in terms of strategic planning and a strategic view of what actions are needed now to prepare for the future. Knowing when to say no, I think it gets to be important, and perhaps early on saying no is probably something, I confess I didn't do it well, and I'm not sure I do it well even now, but certainly at one point in your career, if an opportunity came along, the first thing you said was yes. And if you're really on an uphill trajectory here, there may be times when you just say no to something more because it's not something that you're interested in. There are other things you'd rather be doing with your time, which obviously is a finite resource. Looking for synergies with colleagues, and this relates to the networking that we just heard Dr. Nathan talk about. But I think a lot of those things, those opportunities to either be involved in projects or initiatives that are related to the activities of others, and how you can help out. And as I mentioned, I believe, at least for my career, an awful lot of this has just been showing up. And this quote, you can find various sources for it. It may be Woody Allen. The number may be 70%, it may be 90%, but in any event, I think we would agree that an awful lot of the success that leaders have is just showing up and kind of doing what's expected of you. And I'm asked quite frequently, how did I wind up at the AVR? When I think back to 15 years ago as a volunteer, I was asked to fly to Atlanta and start to write items for the continuing certification exams. And they wanted me partly because I was private practice, and they said, "I need that perspective." And that kind of made sense. And I left directly from work, and we'd been given a homework assignment. We'd been given about 15 or 20 spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet pages. And I got on the plane realizing I had them in my briefcase, but I hadn't looked at them. And I admit that in the 2-hour flight or 2.5-hour flight, I looked through as many as I could. And I showed up the next day thinking they're going to find out I got through about half of these. And what we had to do was review the cases and at least start to categorize them and start to assemble them into something meaningful for this exam that the ABR was administering. And what ultimately happened is I realized when I showed up the next day that my colleagues, who were brilliant and great people and actually good role models, all a little more senior than I was, they hadn't done any of them, or had done very few. Maybe they'd done 1 page, and I had done 10 of the 20 pages, or whatever it was. And there's a lesson in there if you, depending on, even if at a minor committee, if you read the agenda ahead of time, you show up prepared to discuss the issues. You're there and you're engaged, and I think that's a key to success for a lot of us. Eventually, of course, with in this late career environment, we take on more roles in state and national arenas. This is based a little bit on your track record. Again, those things that you do because you showed up, because you were engaged, because you were willing to help out and volunteer for things when those opportunities came along. And also your refined interests that might come from this. It's the track record, it's the refined interests as a subset of your experience that start to be, I think, a little more focused over time. And it's the relationships that you form over time. And these are all important elements of how do you acquire these roles in state and national arenas that are rewarding to you because they're within your interest. And of course, the organization benefits because you have that experience to fall back on. In late career, of course, we have more opportunities to benefit from mistakes because we've made more mistakes. And certainly it's true in my case. I will just cite 3 examples. I found that in my private practice group, I would incorrectly apply my own preferences to my colleagues. For example, I really don't need frequent communications. Communicate with me when it's something actionable, when it's something that I need to know to act on. It's a decision needs to be made, or it's background information for something we're going to be discussing. Those are things. Whereas some of my colleagues might quite reasonably say, no, we want to be kept in the know about what's going on. And in a democratic private practice group, that would be problematic only because I wouldn't necessarily think that same way, and I'd be applying my own biases, my own values to those communications. That was an error on my part. I should have been more aware of what they wanted instead of just what I would have wanted in their situation. Effective decision making sometimes results in the right decision, even when viewed in retrospect. But if you don't ask others to be involved in that process, it's going to be questioned, even though, again, it might be the right decision intellectually, but was it accomplished or arrived at it the right way? And then last, there sometimes when you just have to admit that your own aspirations for the organization might be at odds with the majority opinion. That maybe that doesn't mean one is wrong and one is right. It's rather that maybe it's out of sync. And in that sense, then you have to relook at yourself and kind of say, okay, maybe my role is different in this organization, rather than trying to set the vision if it's inconsistent with what the majority wants and inconsistent with my own values. Well, then you adjust and you take on perhaps a slightly different role, which kind of gets to this idea of purpose and, why are you doing what you're doing? Why do you want to lead? And I think that's part of it. It's for me, I spent most of my career believing I'd rather work for a good boss than be the boss. And then eventually these opportunities start to come up and you start to realize this kind of interesting work that we do, where we get to create something bigger than ourselves. We get to be parts of teams. We get to do some, arguably some interesting things that otherwise, you might just be, again, reading that next CT scan, which in itself can be a reward, providing patient care, but at the same time, maybe that's not what you're interested in doing. And it's kind of funny, every once in a while someone would say, well, what's it like to be in charge? And I say, as a practice leader or a department head in a non-academic setting, you're really not in charge. That's an illusion because you're basing your successes on consensus, and you bring the team along, and it's not a question really of you know, the sort of the dictator mentality. So it gets to be an interesting paradox sometimes that you're leading from a position of strength that is only derived from how much faith your followers have in what you're doing. How are you delivering on that vision or that strategic direction? Or in fact, the tactical decisions you might make. I will admit, I'll share another brief story that my mantra kind of all along was, how can I serve? And a colleague one time, we were talking about some meeting, I can't remember what it was about, but you know, the question directed to me was, how do I get in on this? Meaning, how do I get in on the meeting? And I'm thinking, well, that's not really the right reasons, at least from my perspective. You know, it really should be, how can I serve the organization, not what's in it for me. The idea of servant leadership is really founded on emotional intelligence in a big way, as we just heard about. So those are something to keep in mind. I think this idea of purpose really is key to what motivates us, and that's, I won't say it's adjustable per se, but it really is something that is very individualized and very personal. And that relates to this, is the focus of what is most rewarding, and really what this is addressing is what's most rewarding for you. And this becomes more important in late career, I think, because what you're really starting to say is, well, I can in some ways kind of pick and choose. And in a private practice environment where I spent most of my career, you know, I was more interested in teaching and things like quality and safety, peer learning. You know, could we build teams? Could we enhance service lines? Could we innovate at the system level? And that is what the healthcare system was interested in doing. And these things were important to me. Incidentally, there was a question in the pre-questions that we had submitted about how to deal with the C-suite, and an awful lot of this system level innovation is related to that. And what we would find, and what I found in dealing with the C-suite, which I did over more than a decade, is that it was not all that hard to find a win-win situation, a situation where we could deliver a service enhancement and it actually benefited us. One example was we were bringing radiologists in at 5:30 in the morning, and you'd say, well, why would anybody want to come in at 5:30? We get to go home at 3. So you get to go to the Little League game, or go for a bike ride, or play a game of tennis. And yet the reports for the ICU radiographs were on the in the chart. I mean, they were already signed because, of course, we had packs and we were dictated immediately. And by the time round started, so this was important to the system and benefited us at the same time. And things like that. I think there are opportunities to look for common wins. So these are the things I tried to go through quickly during the session, and I hope this was of some value to you, looking at this expanded perspective that we gain over time, the obligations that we have to be mentors and coaches. I think you do take on more roles in state and national arenas. We really can learn from, you know, in a perfect world, of course, you learn from other people's mistakes, and most of the time I just learned from my own. Unfortunately, those were far more plentiful, it seemed. The enhanced sense of purpose for what you're interested in doing, and related to that, this focus on what is most rewarding for you. So so there's my email. Reach out to me anytime. I look forward to the Q&A that's coming up, and thank you for your attention. I'll turn things back over to Dr. Pyatt and Dr. Lexa.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wagner. And we'd like to have, we have Dr. Rodgers back on with us also, and Dr. Nathan will be joining us. There she is. All right, so we're going to go into our panel discussion and pull some questions from the audience as well. Just as a reminder to the audience, as you can see on the screen there, go to the Q&A pane and submit any questions that you would like to have addressed by the faculty. So I'll start off with the first one. Looking back, how would you avoid the mistakes that you made? The number of, I think all three of you discussed this a little bit in your presentation, but I guess if you would summarize the key, the highlight there, how would you avoid the mistakes you made?
Well, I guess I can talk a little bit about with the interpersonal skills in my talk. I think if I could go back in time, I would have probably started learning more about emotional intelligence and taking more RLI courses that address this earlier on. So that way, when I was in my first job, I would be better equipped on handling some of these different situations. So I think kind of just getting more of a jump start on things.
Yeah, I guess the mistake that I mentioned in my talk was writing the ACR resolution. And I mean, how could I have prevented that? I mean, talking to more people about the resolutions, just kind of talking to other more experienced people who had written them and shopped them around and kind of figured it out. I mean, I did that a little bit, but I guess, you know, kind of getting into it, things happen in a strange way. You know, but on the flip side of that, I would say, again, don't be afraid to make a mistake. I mean, that's how you learn what you need to focus on. So kind of put yourself out there, do it. It's not life or death. It's different from reading a CT scan from the ER. You know, so if you don't succeed 100% the first time, try again. And you'll learn from it, and then you'll know yourself what you need to focus on, and then do that. As long as you only make a mistake once, it's fine.
I'll offer two mistakes. One was actually sort of related to emotional intelligence. I think what I should have done, there were times when I should have assumed the best of people, colleagues, medical staff members, technologists, whatever it might be, and express that assumption that you're assuming the best. In other words, convey to other people that you believe this person, you know, is doing a good job. This person is really in some ways behaving in an unselfish way, and I don't know that I conveyed that enough to express it, or even made that assumption perhaps as readily as I should have. The other thing is I wish I'd been more intentional in seeking out a mentor back when I was in my early kind of transitioning into mid-career, perhaps. In small departments, it may be difficult. You may have to go outside the department. And I wish, in retrospect, I had kind of taken, you know, some of the more senior surgeons, perhaps, or internists or specialists, and just said, you know, what's your view on things? You know, as far as advancing your career and being able to be involved in things bigger than yourselves. And I wish I had done that more intentionally than I had.
Thank
Okay, we have another question that was for the panel, and then we're and what successes surprised you? I know we heard a little bit in some of the three talks, but what are some successes that surprised you in the course of your leadership journeys?
I can lead off on that one. You know, I mentioned kind of my low partner paycheck that time, and then, you know, I started trying to figure out ways to increase revenue for the practice. In that couple year rebuilding period, we did end up making more money than they had made before after my efforts. But in that period, I started just cold calling places, and I actually opened up the city paper one day and saw that there was a new gynecology office opening in town, and they had bought their own mammography machine, and they were touting how they were doing this. And I was like, well, who's going to be reading them? So I just randomly picked up the phone and started calling. And, you know, the vendor had set them up with a teleradiology company from out of state. They were going to be doing that. And I said, hey, we're a local radiology group. We can be here. I can come over. I can do biopsies. I can, you know, do all this other stuff. And so they just gave us the contract. And it was a huge amount of money that we made from all these mammograms that we're reading. Literally, I just picked up the phone. You know, it's just amazing. But just put yourself out there, try to do things, and you never know what the result will be. Sometimes it will lead nowhere, but sometimes it will.
Right.
Yeah, I'm going to agree with Dan on that. I mean, just ask the question or just have that initial conversation with somebody. You just don't know. Don't say, oh, no, I'll never be able to do this. Like, I think in my situation, I was able to build some of these things for myself with teaching and research just by calling people or having conversations and saying, hey, I'm interested in doing this. What do you think? Can we build this radiology residency program here? Can we have a rotation here? Sure. Yeah, let's do it. So I think you'll be surprised if you do open the conversation where it could lead. So don't be afraid to take that first step in the right direction.
I'll confess, when I first took over as chairman, I think I'd been in the job for a couple of weeks, and we had an angry patient and somebody who called in advance and said, I want to talk to the radiologists, plural, who read my 10 MRIs over the last 3 years because 9 of those 10 were incorrectly read or something. And I don't even think I had read any of them actually. And yet I'm in the chair, so I have to defend, our readings on these. And I looked through them and I'm like, yeah, some of these we could have done a better job. They were either unclear, they were complicated cases. The woman had a benign tumor, as I recall, and it was, but it was growing, and it gets a little complicated, some of these cases. And sometimes we'd call it X, or there were typos through the reports. You can imagine trying to defend 10 complicated MRIs over 3 years to a patient who pretty knowledgeable, and certainly with the internet, everybody's a little bit knowledgeable, but she was beyond that. And I was a little nervous because I had never had to sit with an angry patient confrontational before in a conference room. And the risk manager was there because the whole idea was, she hadn't brought legal action and eventually never did. But I was nervous. So I grabbed a notepad off my desk as I was heading up to the conference room, just so that I could make sure I could track through her questions and everything. And I genuinely listened. I was sincere in listening, but I was writing a lot during this thing, partly because I was nervous and partly to kind of keep track of what her concerns were, et cetera. And afterwards, when I left, after 45 minutes, I said, okay, I'm going to leave. And the risk manager remained behind and called me a half hour later and just said, that was amazing. Just because when you're sitting there and you're writing down what she's saying, you are providing a tangible, very visible thing that you're listening. You're not distracted by something else. You're engaged in this conversation. And even though, what I was writing wasn't necessarily it was about the case, but it was not a necessary part of it, but it was a way to demonstrate. So I used that for the next, multiple years that I was chairman and group president. Whenever I had to deal with someone who was unhappy, one way to diffuse it is you go in and you're giving them tangible physical evidence. I'm listening to you. And in fact, I was listening to her, but beyond that, it made it clear that that's what we're doing. So that was just a surprise. And, since the question said, what successes surprised you? That surprised me. I wouldn't have thought it would make a difference. And a little thing like that makes a difference.
Okay, great. Question number 3. What single advice or take-home point would you like the audience to remember? Single advice or take-home point for the audience.
I can go first if you want. Just I'll just, in a way, I'll be repeating something I said earlier, but the one thing I would suggest to anybody, whether it's a more junior colleague or anybody in the audience, you got to be doing these things for the right reasons. And it really is. It shouldn't be what's in it for me. It should be, middle. You're going to advance your career. You're going to create new opportunities to do fun things that are interesting to you, that are complicated problems, that are almost, they're intoxicating because they are so complicated, because they involve multiple stakeholder groups. And the success looks good, because you in fact accomplished something. But at the same time, I think it's important. Most of the leaders that I've talked to, what's rewarding really is that you did it in service to others, and the fact that you benefited is terrific. But the reality is, it really should be about how can I help, as opposed to what can I extract from this or what can I get out of it. And I know that sounds altruistic and a little bit like a cliche, but the fact is, I think the best leaders and I'll say the happiest leaders are the most satisfied leaders. There's a core of that in all of this.
Yeah, I'll say the take home from my talk, if people remember nothing else, is just to, again, I directed it towards early career people. You may not have a title, you may not have a formal leadership position, but try to just find a problem that you can kind of work on and contribute to a solution to. And that's a way for you to show that you're a leader, you're a self-starter. You want to improve the group and the workflow around you. And when you start doing that, you will develop a reputation, and then people will notice you. And then when there are positions, you will be thought of to be put into those roles. So that's an easy thing that anybody can do, whether you want formal positions or not. And as I said, the side benefit is you're going to make your life easier and better. as a result of it. So it's an easy step for anybody to do.
Great.
I think the one take-home point that I would hope people get out of my talk is what I mentioned as my second lesson, which is essentially trying to figure out how to build that dream job for yourself and looking at your resources around you. Because as a mid-career, I can say I know people that have already made several job switches, or say, oh, I'm burnt out, or I just, I don't have this at my job. But I think that article is a really great article that I mentioned in my talk from the ACR Bulletin issue that just came out. I would encourage you to read that article about getting some tips on how, well, if you're burnt out, maybe talk to your leadership about what's burning you out. Try to figure out how can you build happiness in your current job. Is it you're working longer hours than you like? Is it that you feel overburdened with too much complex cases? How can you reduce maybe those cases? Just kind of think about how you can make it work rather than just throwing the towel and start looking around for another job.
Great. Well, thank you. We have some questions in the Q&A box. So we're going to start with an anonymous attendee who asks, what are some ways early career radiologists and residents can become more involved with the ACR?
I'll take that one first off. There's 1,000 ways to get involved. So if you're a resident, there's the resident and fellow section, the RFS. Just go to the website. There's plenty of resources that they can point you toward. Your state chapter probably has an RFS section. So you can get involved locally, probably other people in your program, attendings who may be involved with the ACR can point you in the right direction on that. Definitely try to come to the annual meeting, usually in May of every year. I think it might be in April this year, not sure. But yeah, sign up for that. The ACR supports state chapters with actually some money to send some residents from each state, and a lot of state chapters, my own included, support additional residents, just because we think it's so important to get people exposed to that. So there's a whole day of dedicated resident programming, and then you can stay for the rest of the meeting. And I learned so much. That's how I kind of got involved with the ACR. And again, if your state chapter is supporting you, I mean, it's a trip to DC, with at least some support from there, and you'll meet other people from your home state or a state where you're doing your residency. They're great contacts for jobs, for other stuff later on down the road. If you're early career, there's the young physician section, which kind of functions in the same way as the RFS, but again, for those people who are the first 8 years out of training. So there's plenty to get involved within that. There's emails, there's podcasts, there's other kind of stuff from that, and a dedicated YPS section in the annual meeting as well, with some dedicated programming one afternoon usually. So those are just some quick and easy ways. Go to the ACR website, there's plenty of stuff there. And again, I mean, as chair of the economics committee for small and rural practices, we're always happy to have people join our committees, and there's 100 committees across the ACR in all the different commissions. We have several medical students and residents on our committee. And again, when I was early out of practice, I didn't contribute much. Maybe you just listen the first few times that you call in, but you'll learn stuff and you'll meet people and you'll make contacts and you can kind of develop it from there. So again, don't be afraid to join stuff. Everybody is usually very happy to get people early in training involved.
Great, thank you. All right, I'm going to try to get to a couple more questions here before we have to sign off. Question of the motives of administration are different than the motives of staff and trainees. When trying to approach a solution, how do you try to balance these? What is a strategy that you use to convince the other side that has worked for you, has helped you?
I'm glad to speak to that a little bit, just because I've had at least some degree of success with that. Not all success. Sometimes it doesn't work out. It starts with a fundamental thing, and that's looking for where common interests intersect, right? And it's the idea that you're the fundamental negotiation, which is you're not worried about positions, you're worried about interests, and if you can at least address and identify the interests on the other side, what are they after? What can you provide? What accommodation can you make to satisfy their interests, and at the same time do it in a way that doesn't disrupt your entire operation? And I would argue more often than not, we can come up with something that benefited us in the long run. And incidentally, these were key things to building relationships. I was taken aside by a new CEO we had at our hospital, wound up being there for 10 years, but he was in his first year actually, and been there about a year. He said, took me aside. He said, Brent, I never hear anything about radiology. I go, that's how I want it. I don't want you to hear that there's a problem, because he had never been in a hospital where the medical staff wasn't beating down his door about complaints about radiology. And I said, if you're not hearing anything, that's good, right? And he goes, it's terrific. So that's what we were delivering, was basically provide good service. And I'll admit there were battles lost, but I don't know if that completely addresses the question, but that's how we would approach it. Look for common interests and balance those.
That's great advice. Another person has asked, as a late career radiologist, is it ever too late to take on more leadership roles when you haven't done as much leading previously? So is it ever too late to start and to take on leadership roles?
Short answer is no, I don't think it is. I think, again, if you're doing it for the right reasons and you're drawing on past experience and what you've sort of acquired over time, I don't think the absence of a prior role is not what matters. It's do you have that ability to see the big picture, to see what these competing interests might be, and it doesn't have to be your hospital administration. It could be a whole bunch of things related to who those stakeholder groups are. But Frank, would you be willing to comment on that? You've seen more of this, perhaps not.
Yeah, I would completely agree with you, and I think I would call myself a late starter. I was much more interested in kind of being a neuroscience geek than anything else, and then my life changed a bit. My record was I had a 58-year-old who was getting an MBA to take on a stronger leadership role in the academic place where they worked. So, and I think that as you've already heard, I'm kind of jealous of people like Doctors Nathan and Rodgers who got started really early. I started late myself. But I do think that in the end, one of the things we bring is experience. I would also agree that it's, by now I've made a lot of mistakes, so I can share what not to do with people, which I think is very helpful. In flying, there's always the cliche that you'd rather learn from other people's mistakes, but sometimes, to me, I'm always more reminded of the scene in the movie Zero Dark 30, where as the helicopter is starting to crash, one of the SEALs yells out, how many people have been in a helo crash? And a whole bunch of hands go up. And I think one of the advantages of making mistakes or going through tough times is that you know what it's like. You can see it coming and you know what to do in ways that people who have been fortunate to not be in this situation don't. And so you can be very helpful. So I think the answer, that's a long answer, but the short answer is that I think that you have a lot to contribute and it's never too late to get started.
Okay, we've come across a deadline here with time this evening. And I'd like to thank my co-moderator, Dr. Lexa, and all of our faculty. Thank you for a really wonderful evening. If you have any other questions, please contact the RLI at rli@acr.org, and you will receive a follow-up survey in the next few days. And we would appreciate it if you would complete the survey and give us your feedback. You will also receive a link to view a recording of today's webinar by the next week. The next Power Hour webinar is titled, Don't Be Surprised by the No Surprises Act, Impact to Radiology Practices and What You Need to Know. And this is scheduled for Thursday, February 16 at 7 p.m. You can go to www.acr.org/power hour to register for this and other webinars in the series. If you've enjoyed this program and want more leadership training, the RLI has a plethora of options available at acr.org/RLI. You don't have to be a department head to be a leader. Leadership is for everyone. On behalf of the RLI and our presenters, thank you for joining us this evening and have a great remaining evening. Good night, everyone.
Thank you.